Hi, welcome to today's video. My name is Paul. So this week, again, I had the chance to do a bit of watercolor landscape painting, some loose, wet and wet style landscape painting. I also this week wanted to talk about I think the importance of experimenting and trying different things, particularly around the use of watercolor medium. So I'm going to talk about three different artists. The first one is William Turner. So William Turner, the famous English landscape and seascape painter. And of course his paintings don't look like anything from that time period or even before his time period. They look quite modern in their approach. And William Turner obviously decided that he was going to focus on sort of atmospheric light effects rather than realism and details. So it was quite a different approach to painting. Now, some people, not everybody, but some art historians have said that that style of painting, that style of using oil paint, which was quite unique at the time, possibly came from his experiments with using watercolor. Particularly wet watercolor painting. And he was able to get these sort of atmospheric, translucent effects with watercolor, and he tried to copy that or imitate that using oil painting. And whether or not that's true, I don't know, but certainly the way he used oil paint was quite different from the way other artists were using oil paint at that time. The second artist, so we're moving forward a few hundred years now, I think there's a bit more agreement about the effect of using watercolor and what it had on her art style. And the artist is Georgia O'Keeffe, who's probably best known for her large sort of somewhat abstract landscapes and flower paintings. We know that from 1916 through to about 1918, she worked as the head of the art department in West Texas College. And we also know that during that period, she started experimenting with watercolor and producing basic abstract watercolor paintings. And of course at this time, like 1916, abstract painting was still a bit of a new idea. Even artists that have been kind of experimenting had still had one foot in realism and maybe just dipped their toes into a little bit of abstraction. But she was doing quite abstract watercolor paintings. And it was after that that her style of doing landscapes and the flower paintings really developed. And although she moved back to oil paint, some people agree that her experiments with watercolor did have an effect on her style of oil painting. The third artist then is Mark Rothko. Of course, he's famous for very abstract painting, sort of, fields of color type painting, whatever you want to call it. But if you look at Mark Rothko's early paintings from, say, the 1930s, they look completely different. I don't mean they look slightly different or a little bit different. I mean they're completely different in their subject matter. They're not abstract paintings. He was doing kind of, I guess most people refer to it as social realism. He was painting figures, basically human figures, mainly around cityscapes, that type of thing. Again, during the 1940s, he began to experiment with watercolor painting, and he moved from doing this sort of figurative work to doing things which were much, much more abstract. And it was after that then in the 1950s that he started producing this sort of painting style that he really became famous for. It's sort of very abstract, as I say, maybe field of color type of painting. So I guess what I'm trying to say, I'm not saying that if you paint with watercolor you'll become famous, although those three artists did, but certainly they experimented. They weren't afraid to try a different medium and to experiment with it, and maybe take some of those ideas and also add in a bit of abstraction. I say take those ideas, and when they moved back to oil painting, they incorporated some of these ideas, whether it was abstraction or the way in which they used oil paint. So basically what I'm trying to say is I think experimenting is good. It can help us to develop a more mature, more developed way of painting, I think. And certainly if you're going to experiment with watercolor, I would definitely recommend trying wet in wet style painting, and also introducing a bit of abstraction. Don't be afraid to play around with these things. It's an experiment, so if things don't turn out exactly what you'd hoped, that's fine. You learn from that and move on. But the important thing is to try experimenting and being brave and trying something different, I think. With this painting, at the beginning you may have seen I applied some paint using an old acrylic paint tube. I've seen people using things like old credit cards and different things, palette knives. I didn't have any of those things lying around, so I did have some old acrylic paint tubes, so I just used those to dip them into some liquid watercolor paint and then apply them onto wet paper just to see what would happen. And I want to try experimenting with a few other ideas that I have. So definitely I'll be trying some more experiments over the next few weeks using watercolor. Overall, I'm happy with the final painting. It was fun making it, and as I've said before, I think that's one of the key things. If you're having fun and you're kind of approaching it like a child approaches painting and drawing, you're not focused on, does it look good and what is the final result. You're more focused on just the process of creating something and having fun just making art. Okay, well, if you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching and listening, and hopefully see you again in next week's video.